I was really excited to be invited to be part of this discussion. I think the research is really interesting on a couple of different levels. Firstly, it's about 6 months since the Scottish Government declared a national housing emergency, and Argyll and Bute was the first council to do that. That was in June 2023, so about 18 months ago from now. And I think that when we've been talking about the housing emergency, a lot of the focus has been on the supply of affordable and social housing, which is really, really important. We need to build more homes, we need to make more homes available. But the private rented sector can be overlooked in that discussion, and it's such an important part of the overall housing system. We can't address the housing emergency if we're not looking towards the private rented sector and addressing some of the challenges there. So I'm really pleased that Argyll and Bute have looked towards the private rented sector with this research. Secondly, I think a lot of the time when we're talking about challenges in the private rented sector, we're thinking about the big cities where we've seen really high rent increases. We're thinking about Edinburgh and Glasgow, maybe about some of the university towns and cities where students add another layer of complexity and demand into those populations. And we're not really thinking about the rural areas that can be affected as well. So I think it's really interesting to see this piece of research looking at the private rented sector specifically in a rural context and some of the challenges there and some of the insights that come from the research. So I'm not going to say too much more. We've got a lot to get through this morning, and we want to make sure that there's time for questions from the audience as well. So if you do have any questions for our speakers, can you please pop your questions into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and I'll try and get through as many of those as possible. And we've got a great lineup of speakers on the panel for you today. We're going to hear from Dr. Andrew Watson, who's the Research Associate with the UK Collaborative Centre for Housing Evidence, and he was the lead researcher on this project. We've got Douglas White, the Strategic Housing Lead at Argyll and Bute Council. We have Aoife Deary, the Senior Policy Officer with Citizens Advice Scotland. And we also have Dr. John Boyle, who's a Research Director for Retty & Co. But before we get to our panel, we're going to hear a few words from Jen Broadhurst. Jen is the manager at the Argyll and Bute Citizens Advice Bureau. So I'll hand over to you first, Jen. Thank you.
Thanks, Ashley. Thank you. Good morning, everybody. And apologies, I've got a bit of a head cold today, so I'm hoping that my voice lasts. I'd just like to echo Ashley's comments there and welcome everybody to the webinar today. I'd also like to thank the Centre for Housing Evidence for the incredible backing that they've given us here at Argyll and Bute Citizens Advice Bureau with both our private rental sector research and also for hosting today's webinar. I'd also like to thank Douglas and the rest of Argyll and Bute Council for putting their trust in the Bureau and Leslie in particular and backing us to deliver this research. And of course to the lead researcher, Andrew, whose work provides extremely valuable insight and recommendations for rural landlordism at this really critical time when the availability of housing sadly isn't anywhere close to where it's needed. It's probably worth reminding everybody watching this morning that Argyll and Bute is Scotland's largest council area. It's beautiful, it has fantastic businesses, resilient communities, and extremely resourceful individuals living in those communities. But it also has some very significant challenges. Whilst areas in the east and central of Scotland have seen population growth really sort of double in terms of the parameters that we're looking at, Argyll and Bute's population has been declining for well over a decade. And it's also ageing quite considerably. We're acutely aware of this, and Argyll and Bute Council, we're welcoming, has set their overarching aim, and this is extremely clear. The economy and the population across Argyll and Bute really does need to grow. As the manager of this bureau, our team support people in so many different ways every day. The support includes a lot of housing advice, and our advisors invariably find a number of other life issues intertwined amongst those housing areas. They can be very complex, far too complex to even scrape the surface of today. But one thing stands out, that when people don't have a secure place to call home, the impact cuts deep, and that's harmful to every aspect of their lives. As a Citizens Advice Bureau, we feel passionate that a deeper understanding of the price of not having a home is needed. The importance of safe, affordable, suitable housing in the right places is critical to living a decent life for health and well-being, for education, for employment, for local economies, and across the years to come in those rural areas such as Argyll and Bute. Housing is absolutely intrinsic to our communities, to sustaining public services and having any real chance of economic growth. Bureaus across the country are synonymous with advice services, but more than that, we want to use our evidence and place in civic society to exercise a responsible influence on the development of social policies and services, locally and nationally. And we're ideally placed to do just that. The Citizens Advice brand definitely helps to foster trust and engagement, and at Argyll and Bute Citizens Advice Bureau, we have an intentionally focused our research and resources on one of the most serious of social policy issues that are facing people today, and that's housing. Back in 2022, we published some research looking at the local private rented sector from a tenant's perspective, and the natural progression of that research was to further understand the sector from a landlord's perspective. And partnering with Argyll and Bute Council and Dr. Watson, we've committed to supporting the local housing consultation plan through this work. Scotland's first declared housing emergency in 2023 is something I'm sure Douglas White will cover, but for us at Argyll and Bute Citizens Advice Bureau, we want to support sea growth and affordable housing in rural communities and urge all decision makers to take a whole sector approach where every house, every home counts, and we do all that we can to sustain the housing stock we have, whilst efforts are ramped up to increase the number of homes available for the very existence of viable rural living in the future. Thank you.
Thanks, Jen, and thanks for giving us that context and to start us off this morning. I'm just going to hand over now to Dr. Andrew Watson, who's going to give us an overview of the findings of the research and some of the recommendations as well. Andrew, we can see your slides, but I can't hear you.
The classic mute unmute. I'll start again.
If you're on mute or not. Thank you.
Thanks, Ashley. Hello, everyone, and thanks again for attending. I'm going to provide a short overview of the research, which focused on better understanding the challenges faced by private landlords within Argyll and Bute. The study is the first major research project focused on rural landlords, and it covers a lot of ground. Unfortunately, there isn't time to cover all of the topics, and therefore I recommend reading the full report when you get a moment. I'll begin today by covering off the role of the PRS, the research purpose and the research design. I'll then provide a brief overview of the research context before discussing the findings of each research objective. I'll wrap up with a brief conclusion and summarise some of the report's recommendations before handing back to the chair. The PRS plays a really critical role in Scotland's housing system, providing accommodation to a myriad of tenant groups. Within Argyll and Bute, the sector supplies around 10% of households, and although this is slightly down on earlier years, the sector continues to play an important role. For many of the tenants that live in the sector, the PRS is a legitimate and attractive destination of choice. For others, however, it is effectively their only option due to high house prices and a lack of affordable housing supply. Despite the sector's importance, we know little about the current views of landlords that make up the sector or anything about their intentions moving forward. This is problematic in the context of the housing emergency, which presents an urgent need to stabilise and grow housing supply. In response to this shortfall, the purpose of the research was to better understand the composition of rural landlords, using Argyll and Bute as a case study. We hope to identify the extent to which they differ in key measures from non-rural landlords, to explore the specific investment challenges that they face, and to quantify their future investment intentions. The research adopts a mixed methods design consisting of an online survey of Argyll and Bute landlords, followed by a series of semi-structured interviews. In total, just over 10% of registered landlords responded, representing around 12% of properties. Before discussing the research findings, and I know that Ashley and Jen have touched on it briefly, but I just wanted to say a bit on the research context. The work was undertaken during a very turbulent period. For example, the effects of the eviction ban were still fresh in the memory of some landlords. And during the course of the research, the rent cap expired, a consultation for a heating buildings bill ended, and a new housing bill was introduced. In addition, the Scottish Government joined several local authorities in declaring a housing emergency. Economic factors are important too. Interest rates were at relatively high levels, which increased costs, but also made some alternative investments more attractive. And despite inflation trending downwards, the cost of living crisis continued to impact both landlords and tenants alike. There was also political change with the appointment of a new Scottish Housing Minister and a new government in Westminster. So there was quite a lot going on. One of the research objectives was to identify the composition of rural landlords and whether their characteristics, motivations, and investment behaviours differed from non-rural landlords. A secondary data set was initially used to achieve this, and overall it was found that rural and non-rural landlords were more alike than different. However, there were some small differences. For example, rural landlords tended to be slightly older than non-rural landlords, and their investments tended to be less profitable, at least in terms of net yields. Delving a bit deeper here, the secondary data reveals that 39% of rural landlords achieved a return of 6% or more, against a figure of 40% for non-rural landlords. This broadly suggests that rural landlordism, at least measured by net yield, is less profitable than non-rural landlordism, although the difference in outcomes may be partially explained by the rural premium. The research also set out to understand the challenges faced by rural landlords. Before doing so, we asked landlords if they believed that policymakers understood the challenges that landlords faced. In total, 3/4 of landlords did not believe that the Scottish Government understood these challenges, whereas the figures for Argyll and Bute Council was 45%. It's perhaps not surprising that the local authority scored better, although concerns still clearly remain. It could be suggested that these results are at least partially attributable to a lack of robust communication and engagement between landlords and policymakers. The survey asked landlords to rank a list of key challenges with a score between 1 and 10. The top 4 challenges revealed were the maintainability of dwellings, the availability of tradespeople, the burden of legislation, and the energy efficiency of buildings. It's interesting that 3 out of 4 of these directly relate to the tangibility of property, especially because landlords often report that the tangibility is what makes property investment attractive in the first place. The biggest issue facing landlords was the maintainability of buildings, dwellings. During interview, landlords reported that the age, type and rural location of dwellings had an impact upon their maintainability. Several landlords owned properties that were prone to weather beating or being lashed by sea spray, and this sometimes necessitated enhanced repair and maintenance regimes in comparison to less precarious locations. However, the issue of maintainability was also a link to the availability of tradespeople, which took second place. The poor availability of trades is driven by a range of supply and demand challenges which are not conducive to quick fixes and in any event are beyond the scope of this research. For this reason, the extent of the challenge remains largely unquantified. There is no local estimate of demand by work type or tenure, neither is there a detailed aggregate analysis of the likely impact of future legislation and initiatives on demand. This is an area that clearly needs further attention. Although the lack of tradespeople was prevalent across Argyll and Bute, the problem was felt more keenly in remote rural and island locations. There also appeared to be a shortage of different trade types in different areas, as are illustrated on the slide. The lack of trades has clear consequences for both landlords and tenants. Landlords reported that they had responded to the challenge by either postponing works, paying over the odds, or carrying out works themselves. Tenants, on the other hand, were sometimes placed at risk of living in non-compliant or substandard properties until trades could be sourced. The broader concern here is that conditions are not always optimal to begin with, and chronic under-maintenance resulting from a lack of trades could make the situation considerably worse. Moving on to the next challenge, the burden of legislation. As it has grown, the PRS has been subject to increasing levels of legislation. There are differing views on whether this has gone too far or has not gone far enough. However, as landlord perceptions of the legislative environment can have a bearing on the stability of investment patterns, we asked them if the current environment balanced the needs of landlords and tenants. Unfortunately, the majority disagreed. Furthermore, almost 2/3 did not believe that the current legislative regime supported PRS investment. It's possible to debate or disagree with these views, but it's important to recognise that private landlords who make up the bulk of the sector are making PRS investment and divestment decisions based upon them. Landlords expressed a range of very candid views about the burden of legislation and the general direction of policy travel. They raised issues of fairness, cost, and the relevance of different changes. However, overall, and it's a really important point, landlords were not anti-legislation per se, but they wanted some respite and for future change to be, and it's a very long list, risk-based, relevant, properly assessed, planned in advance, effectively communicated, and both applied and enforced equitably. Picking up on the last point, the enforcement of regulation re-emerged as a major concern for landlords. And I say re-emerged as landlords have been complaining about the lack of enforcement for around 20 years. Landlords were frustrated that they were spending time and money in compliance when others appeared not to do so without penalty. This is obviously problematic. To counteract this, landlords were broadly in favour of increased and targeted enforcement. This suggests an area in which policymakers could realise some quick wins that could improve the sector. The final challenge I'll talk about today relates to the energy efficiency of dwellings, which was ranked as the 4th largest area that landlords were concerned about. This is not surprising, given that a number of the properties owned by landlords in the study would be difficult and expensive to retrofit. However, the interviews revealed that most landlords were unaware of new and more flexible options being suggested under the proposed Heat in Buildings Bill, and were instead making investment decisions based upon earlier, now stalled policy directions. This suggests a failure of landlords to proactively engage with sector change, but also a failure of communication by policymakers. Landlords raised a variety of other issues in relation to energy efficiency, including doubts over the robustness of the EPC system, concerns as to the suitability of retrofit measures, and worries over funding. And of course, the poor availability of tradespeople was seen as a considerable barrier to retrofit. Finally, the report set out to understand landlord intentions. It was found that 62% of landlords intended to keep the number of properties they owned the same, a third intended to sell one or more properties, and just 5% intended to buy more. The net outflow of properties in Argyll and Bute would equate to around 3% of the existing PRS stock. This is concerning, as even a small number of properties can impact the viability of small rural communities. While some intended to leave in 2023 when the research was carried out, or initially carried out in 2024, others planned much later departures, which were often tied to the natural expiration of tenancies or other factors. Why are landlords leaving? Landlords identified a number of reasons for leaving the sector, some of which have already been discussed. However, the majority pointed to the cumulative impact of legislation. This is interesting as policy impact assessments tend not to focus on cumulative impact. However, the interviews revealed that the decision to sell is often multifaceted, influenced by multiple investment, environmental, personal, and circumstantial factors. In these cases, a single reason might contribute to the decision to leave or act as a tipping point, but it was rarely the sole driver. For example, for several landlords, it was a combination of getting older, the lack of trades, frustration at the pace of legislative change, and the opportunity to obtain better returns elsewhere. Amongst these, the ageing of a super cohort of landlords is an area that requires further attention. Though the findings are stark, there is a possibility that landlords are crying wolf and will not ultimately leave the sector. However, the Scottish Household Survey points to the sector already shrinking, and although there are issues with the data, the landlord registration system suggests that we passed peak landlord back in 2016 and that numbers are continuing to fall as far ago as a couple of months back. This view is slightly contradicted by a growth in registered property numbers. However, this may be partially due to short-term let transfers and mid-market additions skewing the data. Although new landlords will continue to enter the sector, new entrants are subject to the same challenges and barriers as existing landlords, and it is not clear how robust future inflows will be. In fact, anecdotal evidence from letting agents suggests a drop in the number of new entrants over the last year. Given the continued development of legislation, the ageing of landlords, and the availability of better returns elsewhere, some caution is definitely required. In conclusion, the report finds that the investment challenges faced by rural landlords in Argyll and Bute are numerous and significant. Some are related to geography and others are related to policy. As a result of these challenges, some are choosing to leave the sector, and while some will welcome a reduced PRS, it is problematic in the context of a housing emergency which is heavily characterised by a lack of supply. It's worth noting that when a private landlord sells a property, it does not disappear. It remains within the housing system. However, there is no guarantee that that property will remain within the PRS. It may revert to other tenures, including owner occupation, second homes, or short-term lets. This may be good news for some, but it has clear implications for the security of existing and future PRS tenancies. Local authorities, including Argyll and Bute Council, are diligently trying to respond to the emergency. However, without a renewed and positive focus on the PRS, there is a real danger that any net housing gains delivered by housing emergency outputs could be partially undone by dwindling PRS numbers. With this in mind, the report provides a series of realistic evidence-based recommendations to address the challenges identified. More broadly, the recommendations are designed to support the housing emergency by encouraging the retention of existing landlords within Argyll and Bute, and also to encourage further investment within the sector. The recommendations present an opportunity for the Scottish Government, Argyll and Bute Council and Citizens' Advice to work in partnership with landlords and other interested parties to improve the sector. Recommendations for the Scottish Government are wide-ranging and include setting out the role it envisages for the PRS, the stabilisation of investment patterns, the review of legislative impacts to date, the improvement of sector data, and increased level of landlord engagement and communication, amongst others. Recommendations for Citizens' Advice include improving its offering to landlords and increasing its research output to provide a broader range of balanced evidence-based insights. Recommendations for Argyll and Bute Council focus on measures to improve communication and engagement with landlords and the ramping up of enforcement activities. More broadly, I'd urge anyone involved in responding to the housing emergency not to underestimate current levels of disenfranchisement amongst private landlords, nor overlook the critical role that they play in local and national housing systems. Thank you very much for listening. hopefully my throat's just about managed to get through that. And I'll pass back to the chair now. Thank you.
Thanks, Andrew. That was a lot to get through in a very short presentation. I think you said at the beginning that the research is available online. So please do go and take a look at the full research and recommendations. I know that I've got an awful lot of questions about the research, but if anybody does want to put a question in, please do pop it in the Q&A because we want to hear from the audience as well, not just me. So next up, we have Douglas White from Argyll and Bute Council. And over to you, Douglas.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay? Yeah?
Yeah, perfect.
Great. Right, well, I've just got one slide. There's been a lot of chat about the housing emergency, and obviously Argyll and Bute were the first council to declare a housing emergency. So hopefully this slide you'll be able to see. If you can put it onto the full, brilliant, thank you. So I just thought I would cover what led us to declaring the housing emergency. That I can't see that on my screen, but
yeah, the slides disappeared. Can you try and share that again, Glenn?
There we go. Okay, so in Argyll and Bute, we took a kind of whole. Oh, it's gone again, has it?
We're having some tech issues.
I'll just keep talking here. We took a whole system approach to the housing emergency. We felt that there were problems right across the sector. So if people can see that, I'll just go through the kind of the 8 main factors that we took into account. There's a high number, over 3,000 people on the housing waiting list for social housing. In 22-23, we had a 28% increase in the number of households presenting as homeless. And I'll come back to that a little bit in relation to the private rented sector. Also, the average house price in Argyll and Bute was 7 times the average income level, which restricts people's ability to resolve their kind of housing situations through the market. A little bit of discussion has already been we've talked a little bit about the number of empty homes and second homes. So 11% of the housing stock in Argyll and Bute was seen as ineffective. It wasn't a principal home for anybody. Planning, private housing completions outside the Helensburgh area were really low. So again, restricting opportunities for people to get into the housing market or resolve their housing situations. Big increases in the costs for constructing properties, which they're across Scotland, but obviously island costs significantly higher. And 75% of employers who responded to a survey that we did say the shortage of housing was a barrier to recruiting or retaining staff. So these were all the kind of factors. And I think one of the things that's been mentioned already is the population is projected to decrease in Argyll and Bute. But interestingly, the number of households is increasing. So we're seeing a smaller household sizes, but the number of households seems to be increasing as the population is actually decreasing, which does put pressure on the housing market. So that's a little bit of background. I think people will maybe know that we're a stock transfer authority, but the council kind of remains a strategic housing authority responsible for the housing needs and demand assessment, which is carried out every 5 years, and also producing the local housing strategy. We've got 9 housing market areas across Argyll and Bute. I think Jen talked about the geography. So 9 housing market areas within a local authority shows there's a real variation of factors across the local authority area in relation to housing. So in our current local housing strategy, there is reference to the private rented sector, but looking at it again, I don't think we've put enough emphasis on the importance of the private rented sector in trying to resolve people's housing situations. And we're just at the stages of preparing to carry out our latest housing need demand assessment. So this was a really good opportunity when Jane and Leslie approached us saying that they could carry out this research in partnership with the University of Glasgow. So we kind of jumped at that chance as a council. It was good timing for us. We'd already been thinking a little bit about some of the issues that Andrew's talked about and raised. We were seeing that there was a reduction in the number of landlords across Argyll and Bute. I mentioned about the number of households presenting as homeless had increased, and the highest reason for homeless presentations in the last 2 to 3 years has been other action by landlords resulting in termination of tenancy, which doesn't mean that people are in rent arrears and they're losing their tenancies through their own actions. There's a real pattern of landlords looking to sell and get out of the private rented sector, and that's been happening. We've seen that through frontline inquiries and homeless presentations. And we've always been a bit kind of interested or concerned, I guess, if people in the front housing teams across Argyll and Bute have been trying to deliver housing options. There's been various factors out with our control that have made that more difficult, but you know, we're seeing across the board that the private rented sector is becoming less and less of an option for people, sometimes due to affordability in relation to the local housing allowance. But again, you're looking at 9 housing market areas, so some of the areas the private rented sector is affordable in relation to local housing allowance, but in the real pressure areas like Helensburgh and Oban, they're not. We had a property that we saw last week in Oban, £800 a month for a 2-bedroom. Now the local housing allowance would only pay £598, and £800 a month, I don't know, it probably is slightly less than the bigger cities, but that's an awful lot for a 2-bedroom property. And that's what you're looking at in some of the high pressure areas across Argyll and Bute. So as I've mentioned, you know, we've worked well with CAB over the years, and it was great that they were able to take this opportunity and deliver the research that they've done. As Andrew says, the report is really detailed, and we're still taking our time to get through it. Andrew came to the Strategic Housing Forum in September and presented to partners, energy efficiency organisations, housing associations, different organisations with an interest in housing in Argyll and Bute. So that was a really good opportunity to do that. The 2 recommendations specific to Argyll and Bute, I think one is probably easier to do than the other. The first one is to consider increasing the level of communication and engagement with the landlords. And I think if there's any council colleagues on the call, we all know the pressures that we're under, and it can be difficult to try and improve services with reducing budgets. But we do have an opportunity on this one. We have been successful in getting some addressing depopulation funding, and we're hoping to recruit to a private sector officer role who would complement the landlord registration team and have a bit more time to engage with landlords. So we're hoping that that will materialise. The consider increasing enforcement activities is one that we need to be having discussions with the landlord registration team, and they sit out with the housing team. But we don't want to put any pressures on a service that's already under a lot of pressure. So that'll be a longer term discussion point to see what can be done. And also, is it a perception? You do get landlords saying, well, I've done all that I needed to do, and that person along the street, they're just operating and they've not done anything, and they may well have done stuff to comply with regulations. So I think we need to dig a little bit deeper into that. So from a council point of view, you know, we're delighted to be working with CAB and getting Andrew's input from Glasgow University, and maybe this addressing depopulation fund will give us the opportunity to really take forward some of the council recommendations. But we're also looking at the other recommendations within the final point I would want to say is we probably need more information in terms of the gathering the information at registration point with landlords, and it would be great if we were able to get the number of bedrooms and the rent levels as part of the registration process. and that would give us a much better picture of the private rented sector. So I'll finish on that point. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Douglas. I think lack of data and understanding of the private rented sector comes up time and time again in these discussions, and something that we've heard quite a lot is the need for more enforcement, but local authorities are obviously very tight on resources. So hopefully if you do get some of that funding in, we can start to see some improvements. But I will move quickly on now. We've got Aoife Deary up next from Citizens Advice Scotland. That's over to you, Aoife.
Thanks, Ashley, and thanks very much for having me along to speak. I don't have any slides, but I'm going to talk for a few minutes about why this research was supported by Citizens Advice Scotland and how we're taking it forward in our own work. So for context, Citizens Advice Scotland sits alongside our 59-member Citizens Advice Bureau, as well as the Extra Help Unit, to form Scotland's largest independent advice network. All of the Bureau are independent charities in their own right, and while we at CAS use aggregate information from across the Bureau to advocate on a national level, we also help to support local projects and priorities. So in this case, we provided a small grant to Argyll and Bute Bureau to support the commissioning of this work alongside the larger sponsorship that was provided by Argyll and Bute Council. So our funding was awarded in part following the successful completion of previous work that was already mentioned, that was done in 2022 around tenant experiences of the PRS in Argyll and Bute. And we also recognise the value of further understanding how the PRS operated, especially following the pandemic and in a specifically rural context, which is rarely researched. I think also following on from the previous research focused on tenants, it was important to gain wider perspectives and understand if there are any commonalities, for example, between the challenges faced by tenants and landlords, or if both groups' perspectives could help us to understand problems better. It was also important for us at CAS to do this work so we could engage more closely with the landlord sector and raise awareness about the fact that the network gives advice to everyone, as we're sometimes seen as quite a tenant-focused organisation. This work also links closely to CAS's strategy in that it was aimed at helping people to navigate their rights and build resilience in local communities. And it also aligned with our specific housing work plan for this year, which is aimed at advocating for secure, sustainable and high quality rented homes. So that leads me neatly on to talk about how CAS is going to use the research findings in our work for a Fairer Scotland. This report is really valuable for us to better understand how the PRS is working for landlords and the challenges they face in a rural context. As Andrew mentioned earlier, and as you may have already read yourselves in the report, there are specific recommendations for us at CAS to take forward and consider, and we've already begun doing these. We have recently developed a campaign toolkit for Bureau to run local campaigns on renting. We've called this Keep Renting Right, and this toolkit includes specific information for both landlords and tenants about their rights and responsibilities. So Bureau will be launching these over the next 9 months, and we're hoping that this will particularly help landlords to know that we are a service for them as well. We've also begun work with our digital advice team to improve our online advice offer for landlords too. You'll be aware as well, no doubt, that not only has the PRS changed a lot over recent years, but it's likely to see more change with the Housing Scotland bill that's currently going through Parliament. We're actively involved in work around the bill, and we do want to see it deliver positive outcomes for both landlords and tenants, regardless of whether they're in an urban or a rural area. In order to get this right, though, we've long been calling for the improvement of data, as has just been touched on, better resourcing and enforcement. And these are all issues that are reflected in the report, and so they add evidence and nuance to our calls. For example, it was really interesting to me to see that many landlords who took part in this research had the same frustrations about lack of enforcement against poor practice, and then the kind of impact that this has on themselves as good landlords. I think what the report does warn, and should be heeded as well, is the support that is needed to keep landlords in the sector. About a third of landlords that were surveyed said that they intended to sell all or some of their properties, as Andrew talked about. And when asked why, one of the most common reasons was the cumulative effect of legislation. This obviously has a direct impact on tenants if properties leave the market, as well as it will reduce the availability of homes. This finding isn't really surprising to us. We know that it continues to be complicated to operate in the sector since emergency legislation that was introduced during the pandemic, and it probably isn't going to get simpler. So at the very, very least, landlords need free training and ongoing support to navigate it. So overall, this report picks up on and makes important recommendations on some of the most acute problems in the rural PRS and the wider PRS, frankly, which need to be tackled as part of the response to the overall housing emergency. So I'm really glad to be here today and to take part in this conversation, and I look forward to getting into questions and discussions shortly. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Aoife. We're actually running a couple of minutes behind. I've been a bad chair, so hopefully people can stay on for a few extra minutes at the end. So we will move quickly on to Dr. John Boyle from Retty and Co. I think John's got a presentation for us.
Okay, thanks, Ashley. Morning, everyone. I'm just going to share my screen and hope that it's all okay. Just let me know, Ashley, if that comes up.
Yep, you can see it. That's it. That's the slideshow. Thanks.
Okay, let me know if it vanishes again, as happened to Glenn's, but and I'll put it onto the other version. But okay, this is just I've been asked to come on and provide some thoughts on the research that Andrew led on behalf of Citizens Advice, and yeah, I mean, I think it's a very useful and valuable piece of work. There's a lot of important data there and information on a part of the market that isn't commonly examined, but is important. I've been asked to look at BTR as a possible solution, which is build to rent. So that's institutional funds like pension funds coming in and acting basically as financiers, developers, and operators of new rental homes. It's quite common in parts of Europe, notably Germany, and in the US. Hasn't really beginning to get off the ground in the UK now, but it hasn't really made the progress that I think that was hoped for it. Certainly hasn't done in Scotland. We'll get on to explaining why in a minute. But I don't think it's part of the solution for Argyll and Bute. Build to rent tends to be a city phenomenon. The institutional funds are typically looking at areas or sites where they can do, 300 plus units, make your money work. And the demand for that type of, for that level of accommodation, you can only really find within the city. So now we've got a briefing, a new market briefing on the BTR sector. We produce this annually, and that's being released shortly, maybe even this week. And by our calculations, the pipeline, which is all of the operational BTR units, as well as those that are under construction or somewhere within the planning process, it's around about 19,000 across the country. It's heavily focused in the cities, particularly Edinburgh and Glasgow. And you've got a small single-family housing scheme up at Bertha Park now on the Springfield site by Sigma. But we're struggling to deliver. Only about 20% or so, less than 20% of that whole pipeline is actually operational. And we're struggling to deliver BTR across the UK because of the increasing cost base, including the cost of finance as well as the cost of construction. That's making viability and therefore deliverability much more difficult. And then in Scotland, you've got the kind of additional political risk, which has been heightened, I think, by the rent freeze and then the new housing bill. So there's been no new investment, BTR investment into Scotland in the last 2 years, and we are, if you look at it on a kind of a wider UK basis, you can see the sector is, it's pretty embryonic north of the border. So this is looking at completed BTR units per 1,000 households. And yeah, I mean, the main Scottish cities are lagging the main BTR destinations, which is the likes of Manchester, Liverpool, and some of the London boroughs. And it could have been a significant part of the housing solution, but I think even if there's an exemption from rent control legislation in part of the housing bill, it's going to be difficult to get this investment back when Scotland's been turned off the radar. We'll keep it under review, obviously, but BTR's just not made the progress I think that many people hope for. But I don't think it's part of the solution anyway for rural locations like Argyll and Bute. Just a quick summary of the housing market in the area, and this is from evidence from Andrew's study, as well as some of our own work that we produced earlier this year for Argyll and Bute Council, and a study that looked at the second homes market in the local authority. And yeah, I mean, you can characterise the area as a whole as having relatively high house prices, certainly above the national average, and they're high in a West of Scotland context, and also above average rates of house price growth. So over the last 3 to 5 years, house prices have been increasing at a faster rate than other parts of the West of Scotland and Argyll and Bute. And this has given clear affordability pressures. So, if you look at house prices to earnings, you can see that those ratios are relatively high in Argyll and Bute in a West of Scotland context. And despite, this demand supply imbalance, which should be a signal for the market to boost delivery, that's not happening. And, as we said in our report, you've got market failure here in terms of new build delivery. So I think outside, the likes of Helensburgh and Oban, the developers have got, particular issues. One of them is around labour market issues, because people prefer to be, working in the central belt. There's plenty of opportunities to work in the central belt rather than, out into more remote areas. There's also infrastructure issues and infrastructure burden, usually with remote and rural sites. And there's a lack of SMEs, so a lack of developer capacity, and particularly in the remote and rural areas where SMEs tend to be a key part of the delivery. So we did a report for Homes for Scotland, again published earlier this year, which showed that new build delivery of SMEs has really been decimated over the last 5 years. So in 2017, SMEs delivered 40% of all new build homes in Scotland, but in 2023 that dropped to just 20%. And there were 500 dissolutions of SME builder companies in Scotland in 2023 alone. So that sector has really struggled, particularly since the 08-09 recession. But things aren't getting better, they're probably getting worse. And there is evidence, as we've seen, of an acute housing shortage in Argyll and Bute, but also in other parts of Scotland, and that includes in the PRS. Population is declining as a result of that, including young people, and that's what's underpinned the housing emergency. Second homes is an issue, in part in certain locations, around Lochaw and the Whisky Isles and stuff, but only 6% of all the dwellings in Argyll and Bute are second homes. I mean, that's high in a national context, but it's been a fairly steady state since 2016. So I don't think all of the issues in the local authority area can be put at the door of the second homes market. Finally, just some thoughts on the research findings. So as I said, I don't think BTR is part of the solution here, but mid-market rent, which basically is affordable BTR, but it's tends to be delivered by RSLs instead of pension funds. I think that is part of the solution. There's some useful lessons from Highland local authority area, and Highland Housing Association produced a set of case studies on how you can deliver MMR in successfully in rural locations. It's going to mean more grant support, which of course that grant affordable housing supply programme was slashed in the budget last year. Hopefully it can be reinstated with the Barnett consequentials coming off the UK budget. And MMR may also get an exemption from the housing bill legislation, which I think it will need in order to energise that sector. The PRS is a key tenure in Argyll and Bute, and reliance will need to be on small landlords, because I don't think you'll get the bigger landlords in here. And I think that's recognised, as you saw from some of the quotes in the report by the council. It's particularly important tenure for younger people. Far higher prevalence rates of younger people in the PRS than for other age groups. I think, as has been stated by a number of people on the webinar already, there's huge data gaps in properly understanding the PRS here and indeed everywhere else in Scotland, even on the most basic facts. So, we don't even have reliable supply figures. You can now use the census and see, just how many households are in the PRS in 2022, but how has that been impacted by the rent freeze? Can't say with any certainty. What's been the impact on property conditions as a result of the rent freeze and other government initiatives? Can't say with any certainty. What's the actual rent rises? Actual, not advertised rents, which is what people tend to use, but only about 10% of the stock comes to the market in any 1 year. What's the actual evidence on actual rent increases, and where are they a problem? And therefore, where do we maybe need something like rent controls? Again, we can't say that with any certainty at all. So massive data gaps, which of course means that policy often is like pulling levers in the dark. But I think it is clear that landlords are under cost and regulatory pressures, and they've got alternatives. You can sell up and get into gilts. It's a lot less hassle. And landlords are leaving. Again, it's difficult to be precise about this, and I think it's a trickle rather than a flood. We manage properties mainly across the central belt, and we've certainly lost some stock, but it hasn't been, everyone running for the door. Landlords choose to remain in the sector, vast majority of them, but it's got the potential, I think, to be a flood, and certainly for far more properties to be lost to the PRS in the next few years if we keep going down the road we're going down. And as Andrew said, although properties remain, there will be fewer homes to privately rent, and that's the only option for many residents. A couple of last points. When will we get around to actually enforcing existing legislation instead of more policy initiatives? So, there is a rogue element within the PRS, and, no one operating within the sector would deny it. It's a minority, but it is a significant minority. And this is where most of the problems lie. We have landlord registration. I led the evaluation on it for the Scottish Government about 14 years ago, but it's a monitoring tool. It's a big monitoring tool. It doesn't really have the teeth or the enforcement powers that it should do. And the number of landlords that have actually been kicked out of the sector for not being fit and proper is surprisingly few, given the size of this rogue element. We've also got powers like enhanced enforcement areas, which again have been very seldom used, where you can take the properties and put them under council control, in effect, as has happened in Govan Hill on a couple of occasions, but really hasn't been used much elsewhere. So instead of using the existing legislation effectively, we're just getting tighter and tighter regulations for the bulk of the sector, most of which seems to be operating well. So you can look at the Scottish Household Survey results on satisfaction rates for tenants. Most of the sector is operating well, but these kind of cumulative policy impacts will have consequences for incentives for people staying within the sector, and that's likely to lead to squeeze supply. And then a final, point. I'm not meaning to try and stir things up. I know the Scottish Government people on the call, but is the new housing bill more about political manoeuvring rather than about creating positive change and impacts? There's little analysis or actual analysis that's been done there to underpin the changes that are proposed in the housing bill. It's not really evidence-led policy that we have in Scotland. And it's not seeing housing as a system, but still looking at it in terms of siloed parts. And the housing bill, despite being called the housing bill, really only deals with the PRS. And I think a genuine housing bill, particularly in a time of a housing emergency, should be about how we can energise a supply-led solution, because that's the only way we're going to get out of this. And that's been recognised certainly by the government down south. But I think until we get that type of joined up legislation, given market conditions and everything else, I think things are likely to get worse before they get better. Sorry to end on a depressing note.
Thanks, John. A bit of a bleak outlook for investment in the private rented sector there. Hopefully I can keep you all for an extra couple of minutes just so we can get through a couple of questions before we finish up. I know that we've officially run out of time, but maybe a couple of questions from the audience. There was a question about the number of build-to-rent properties that could be delivered in rural areas, and I think you've answered that already, John. It's not going to happen, and that's not likely to be part of the solution. We did have another question from the audience, or a comment. We've already talked about landlords leaving the market, and his comment was to do with Andrew's findings that landlords in Argyll and Bute are tending to be slightly older than the rest of the population, and these people are likely to be people that have roots in those communities. And if they're retiring out of the private rented sector, who's replacing them? And I think it ties into some of the other discussion points we've had. If landlords aren't feeling listened to, if there's uncertainty about future legislation, about return on their investment, what's encouraging people to start in the private rented sector, if anything? Does anybody want to kick us off? Andrew?
Yeah, hi. I guess it's possible. I think my broader concern is that the next generation may not show up at all, or are certainly not in large enough numbers to replace the ageing demographic. It's a real problem that we're not taking cognizance of. I've had conversations recently with landlords who believed that they were kind of creating mini property dynasties to pass on to their kids, and their kids are now saying, well, actually we don't want these, it's too much hassle, there's too much anti-landlord rhetoric. Why don't we just sell them down and put the money in the bank? And those are real conversations that are happening just now. A lot of landlords are accidental. So people who maybe inherit a property or relocate somewhere else. And before it was kind of a no-brainer to just hold on to that property for a year or two, rent it out, see what would happen. But why would you do that now when almost half the returns are sub 3% net yield, and you can get 5% in the bank? So that's an area of lost new throughput that is really, really challenging. And I don't know how that's going to pan out over the next few years, but I suspect that the numbers are going to drop dramatically.
Douglas, how is the council approaching this? You mentioned the links with, not just homelessness, but health and well-being, employment, bringing skills and people into the area. Are you working with partners across the council to look at a holistic approach to housing? What does this mean for you?
Yeah, I think declaring the housing emergency has raised the profile of a lot of issues that in the housing, working in housing, we've seen. So it's trying to get across different sectors and different partners. Some of the stuff that we're doing, we've got an empty homes officer, part funded by Shelter and by Health and Social Care, to try and get properties back into use for health and social care workers. And part of that's been quite successful on a couple of the islands. And it is about engaging with homeowners and maybe trying to encourage homeowners, maybe who have, like I've said, about housing that's not for principal use at the moment. They're empty homes or second homes. It's trying to engage with those owners to maybe bring them into the private rented sector because I appreciate what Andrew's saying is that, you know, the age is a bit higher in Argyll and Bute. There's accidental landlords with low numbers of properties. So I think on that side of it, we need to try and engage more closely with those people to try and give them options and try and make it more attractive to remain in the private rented sector. And whether that's through the council leasing properties, which we do for homelessness, and we're also working on the health and social care angle, where landlords might look to lease to health and social care workers, or an overall lease to the health and social care partnership, which would maybe give a bit more certainty to private landlords, and at the same time mean that we're tackling the kind of issue around attracting the right skills into the area.
Thanks, Douglas. There's another question or a comment about, I guess we refer to landlords as quite a homogenous group, but they're quite diverse. You know, as you said, some are accidental landlords, some will be investment landlords, some have inherited properties. Do we need to think more about understanding those different types of landlord and maybe targeting? I know we've talked about the lack of communication in general, but how do we be a bit better about making sure that people have the support, the information, the advice that they need as landlords?
I think, as you know, I think, as you know, there are many different types of landlords, but there are also many different types of tenants, and it's not homogenous, as you say. A lot of landlords are not driven purely by financial returns, for example, but we assume that they are generally rational actors. It's not always the case. I think the main problem we've got here is that policymakers do treat the sector with a broad brush from a policy perspective, and there is a lack of nuance to consider not only landlord types and their potential exit strategies, but also the tenant types that they're serving. And again, that's landlord type, tenant type, but also geographies as well. So the difference between rural and cities is entirely different, but again, that's not considered in policy outcomes. So there's a bit more work to be done in understanding the nuances of the sector and how we can better legislate accordingly.
Andrew, Aoife, you wanted to come in?
Yeah, I would agree with what Andrew has said in the main. I think the majority of landlords who come to us for advice are sort of accidental landlords, or they're renting to family or friends. And then that arrangements come to an end, or they want to end the arrangement, and they're finding that it's quite complicated to be a landlord and to act according to the law. So I think, yeah, there are a lot of accidental landlords out there, but and that's not to say though that they don't want to do the best by their tenants and get it right. And it's about supporting them to get it right and supporting them to navigate how to be a landlord, and supporting them to provide sustainable homes as well where possible. So yeah, it's a big concern for us trying to understand these sort of sections of the landlord sector and the motivations behind each. So we're trying to develop our advice around that. But yeah, as you say, there's lots of different types of landlords, and it would be really helpful to get a better understanding of that.
Thanks, Aoife. Maybe got time just to squeeze in a last comment. At the end of your presentation, John, you were talking about the housing bill, quite generally about the impact that could have on the private rented sector. We had a question from the audience about to what extent, if at all, it was taking into account nuances of rural areas. So, for example, rents in some rural areas not being at or around the market, and maybe not being taken into account in the rent control measures. Has any thought been put into the impact in rural areas?
I'm not sure. I mean, that would be a question for government. But you're right that rents aren't always set initially just at market rate. There could be many reasons why landlords go below market rate, and indeed they do go below market rate. So we've got properties that we manage where landlords are very keen to keep tenants, for example, that they've had in for a long time, and rent below market rate. What we've seen with the legislation, or the rent freeze legislation, is that then the rents were hiked up between the tenancies, probably at a faster rate than they would have done, because you were restricted from raising those rents within the tenancies. And that's what gave us a real kind of bulge in the increase in advertised rents in the period following the rent freeze. So it kind of almost had the opposite effect of what was intended. And in Edinburgh and Glasgow, we got double-digit increases in advertised rents, which clearly did put a lot of pressure on tenants. But what is being proposed in the housing bill is that local authorities have the powers to make the decisions on rent control. So you've got a national system of rent control, but it's up to the local authority to make the case and decide on what type of rent control it wants to adopt. And the bill, as is being revised just now, the government is suggesting that cap is up to CPI +1. So at least it gives the index link, which I think the sector has been looking for. The problem with it is that the government is proposing it to be between tenancies rather than just within tenancies. So that's much more rent setting than rent control. And it means that if you're renting below the market rent rate, the property won't be able to catch up, or you won't be able to catch up over time. The other danger of it is, of course, from a landlord perspective, is that there are times when rents have to fall. During the pandemic, for example, rents fell. After the 2008-2009 recession, rents fell. But if you're got to drop your rents in order to maintain occupancy, but then you're limited on increasing your rents at CPI +1, that means that you might not catch up to CPI +1 over the longer term. You might not even catch up to CPI. And if you can't beat inflation, then you really shouldn't be in the market. And I think for many landlords, that inability to make up an inflation-linked return will see more of them leave the sector, unfortunately.
Thanks, John. I think sometimes something like rent control sounds like a simple solution to an affordability issue, but it's obviously a lot more complex than that, and there are some potential risks there. So apologies again for being a very bad chair and letting us run over time. I think we might need to kind of draw this to a close now. So thank you, John, and the rest of our panelists for the discussion. Just a couple of concluding thoughts from me. I think what we're seeing in the private rented sector in Scotland just now is a sector that's characterised by uncertainty. We've got landlords that are not feeling listened to, who might be inclined to look elsewhere for investment. And what impact does that have on the housing emergency that we're experiencing just now? So I think what we really need is clear communication, clear leadership from the Scottish Government. What are we trying to achieve in the private rented sector? Are we trying to shrink it? Are we trying to grow it? Are we trying to encourage in investment? What is the outcome that we're seeking to achieve? And we really need to be looking at evidence-led policy development. And that's why it's really important to have pieces of research like this that are looking at the data and making sure that we have informed decisions as far as possible. So thank you again for sharing the research with us. Thank you for inviting me to be part of the webinar today. And thank you again to all of our panel members. Thank you very much. Goodbye.